Harriet Merriweather traced her finger along the faint lines of graffiti etched into the ancient limestone wall. The inscription seemed out of place amid the ivy that climbed over the cottage's craggy exterior. She stood in the garden of old Miss Wickers, who had invited Harriet over for a cup of tea and to chat about local history. Sparrow's nest was small, but its past always intrigued Harriet, and she'd built a reputation as the village's unofficial historian. She'd stumbled upon the graffiti purely by accident. As the sun cast slanted afternoon rays across the wall, Harriet had noticed odd markings scrawled under the ivy leaves. "Don't mind that," Miss Wickers had said, picking at a loose thread on her cardigan. "It's been there forever, barely visible most days." The words, letters, and cryptic symbols piqued Harriet's curiosity in a way that only a puzzle from the past could. She leaned in, trying to make out the faint, cross-hatched lines. She'd seen many a century-old inscription in Sparrow's nest. Some were children's scribbles, others whimsical doodles by bored farmhands. But this one felt different. The lines were neat and purposeful, arranged in a repeating pattern. Harriet snapped a few photos on her phone for later study. After listening to Ms. Wicker's recollections of local gossip, rumours of missing garden spades, coveted fruit preserves, and weekly crochet circles, Harriet thanked her, promising to come by again. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about the graffiti that demanded her attention. The distant chimes of the church bell reminded her that the local archives at the library would be closing soon. She hurried off, forging a mental plan, cross-exercise, historical graffiti while the memory was fresh in her mind. The Sparrow's Nest Library was housed in a converted cottage that looked even older than Miss Wickers's home, with sloping roofs and narrow windows. Inside, Harriet found her usual corner, a slightly wobbly wooden table near a window that overlooked the duck pond. She spread out her notebook, phone, and laptop. Then she sifted through the library's reference section, selecting a few volumes about local legends, older residents' diaries, and, on a whim, a volume on cryptic symbols in regional architecture. Sparrow's Nest's story was one of rolling farmland, occasional visits from travelling merchants, and an assortment of eccentric artists who came and went over the years. But Harriet had recently discovered scattered references to a minor forgery scandal in the 1930s. She'd never gotten the full story, only fragments about a group of mysterious individuals who had used the quiet village as a front for forging something. Forging what, though? She wondered if it could be currency, artwork, or perhaps documents. She flipped through the musty pages, dust making her nose wrinkle. She took careful notes about known local criminals, petty thefts, and strange arrests. Then she came across a mention. Rumoured ring involves possible forging activity, coded inscriptions rumoured to be on cottage walls. The entry was short, more of a rumour than a fact, but the parallels with Miss Wicker's graffiti were striking. Harriet felt the weight of discovery pressing on her heart. She skimmed the lines again, noticing that coded inscriptions was mentioned. Her mind raced to the graffiti she had just examined. Could it be a relic of that very forger ring? Aha! Harriet settled at her dining table, which was littered with reference books, half-finished cups of tea, and a plate of scones. She zoomed in on the photos of the cottage wall. She sketched out the pattern in her notebook, careful to reproduce every line and tilt. She was no expert in cryptography, but she knew enough about historical ciphers to recognize patterns. Harriet circled repeated letters that seemed to form some sort of an anagram. There was a flourish of lines that appeared to be decorative, but might hold a hidden meaning. The curve of one symbol, for instance, was repeated in several places. She drew shapes to see if they formed letters. Slowly, a potential code started to emerge. Some of the letters and patterns matched up with the year 1933, though it wasn't immediately obvious. Late into the night, Harriet pored over every reference she could find about covert messages. A battered old text about early code-breaking methods suggested that repeated shapes could stand in for specific letters. And if it was indeed from the 1930s, perhaps it was used by a clandestine group who wanted to leave instructions or warnings. Harriet's imagination roamed freely, but she reeled it back in, focusing on the practical side of the investigation. Morning light illuminated Sparrow's nest, revealing cozy cottages, meandering lanes, and tiny shops. Harriet decided that her next step was to look for more graffiti, clues hidden in plain sight. If the forging ring was real, perhaps there were other coded messages scrawled around the village. She strolled down the narrow pathways, scanning walls, fence posts, and gate arches. Her first stop was the old mill, converted into a tea room. She knew the owners, Sally and Tobin, who delighted in Harriet's historical hunts. Over a pot of Earl Grey, Harriet explained that she was on the lookout for any unusual carvings. Tobin nodded vigorously. "We've seen something on the back wall, near the vegetable patch. Bit faded, so we never gave it much thought." Harriet thanked them and hurried outside. Sure enough, beneath a layer of peeling paint, she spotted what looked like the tip of a triangle and a couple of looping lines. She carefully peeled away some of the old paint, doing as little damage as possible, revealing a weathered inscription that had the same repeating shapes as Miss Wicker's cottage. Harriet's pulse fluttered with excitement. Clearly, whatever had been scrawled on the walls was not a one-off. It formed a network of coded messages, possibly spanning the entire village. For the next week, Harriet embarked on a one-woman mission to document every piece of suspicious graffiti. Sometimes she discovered it on a cottage's side that faced the old orchard. Other times, she found it on neglected stone fences in wooded areas. Once, she slid behind an abandoned shed to see if any symbols were carved there. In total, she counted 7 distinct sets of inscriptions, each similarly cryptic, each presumably left decades ago. She pinned up her photographs on a large corkboard in the makeshift study at her home. Trying to decipher them was like attempting a puzzle with half the pieces missing. No single inscription made sense on its own, but Harriet noticed that if she arranged the best preserved ones next to each other, some of the lines aligned to form words. She tested the theory that maybe each inscription was one segment of a bigger code. After hours of rearranging, Harriet spelled out 3 words: coins, fakes, and Sparrow. Her heart thrilled at the possibility that the rumored forging ring might have specialized in counterfeit coins. She then found a partial date. 1933 emerged clearly. Could it be that in 1933 a group of people operated a counterfeit coin scheme out of these cottages? Harriet knew her next step: examine local sources for references to suspicious coins circulating around 1933. In the library's archives, she dug into old newspapers. As she flipped through page after page of births, weddings, and local events, her eyes landed on a small notice. Counterfeit coins found at local market. Anonymous tip warns of a ring operating in surrounding villages. Authorities investigating. She clutched the newspaper clipping, heart pounding. This short paragraph, buried among gardening ads, validated her theories. It was dated October 1933. Another mention followed a few weeks later. All leads have dried up regarding counterfeit coin distribution. Authorities suspect the culprits fled or dissolved their operation. No arrests made. Harriet tapped a pen against her lip. If the ring had vanished without a trace, then the coded graffiti could be all that remained. Perhaps the conspirators had left themselves messages as they moved from place to place. That would explain the spread of markings throughout Sparrow's nest. She next visited an elderly local woman, Mrs. Helmsley, who was a teenager in the early 930s. Harriet found her by the sunny window of her modest living room, sipping milky tea. Mrs. Helmsley was somewhat hard of hearing, but was always delighted to talk about the old days. Harriet explained her interest in 1933. "Ah, yes, dear, I remember. There was chatter in the village about some unscrupulous folk," the older woman said between sips. "Back then, the blacksmith's son was arrested. though I don't recall the details. Rumors flew about coins, about a big city buyer, but it all fizzled out as quickly as it arrived. My father told me never to accept odd coins from strangers that year. That's about as much as I remember. Though the anecdote was fragmentary, Harriet pieced together that at least one arrest had been made, someone local. The blacksmith's son, perhaps, was part of this ring, or at least suspected of involvement. If Harriet could find the blacksmith's family records, she might get another lead. The following day, Harriet searched for records of the blacksmith's son in the library's genealogical archives. She found reference to a Jeremiah Stone, son of Martin Stone, the blacksmith who had lived near the southwestern corner of the village. It seemed Jeremiah had been briefly detained for questioning in 1933, but released for lack of evidence. There were no further public records on Jeremiah. Harriet rummaged through old property deeds, noticing that the Stone family's cottage where the smithy once stood had passed hands multiple times after 1940. Eventually, the property was abandoned. Harriet felt a surge of curiosity. She decided to pay a visit to the old smithy if it still existed. Around midday, she arrived at an overgrown patch of land at the edge of Sparrow's nest, near a footpath that wound into the nearby forest. The remnants of a crumbling stone structure were barely visible beneath the brambles. With cautious steps, Harriet navigated the prickly vines and discovered a battered wooden door. She pried it open, heart racing. Inside, the dim light revealed a chaotic interior: collapsed beams, rusted metal scraps, and piles of debris. She carefully stepped over scattered planks. A dusty anvil lay in one corner. The musty smell of damp wood hung in the air. Harriet cast her eyes about, looking for any sign of graffiti. Then, on a far wall, she caught sight of a faint pattern of etched lines, just like the inscriptions around the village. As Harriet wiped away the accumulated dirt, she made out the same triangular shape and repeating loops. But here, inside what remained of the Stone family smithy, the markings were more extensive, like a larger piece of the puzzle. She pulled out her phone, snapping pictures in every direction. A deeper portion of the design read, "Time Trust Caution, 1933. Beneath those words was a small motif resembling a cluster of sparrows. Harriet's heart hammered. This was undoubtedly the headquarters, or an essential hideout, for the forging ring. She then noticed something jutting from a gap in the wall. A small wooden sign, uncovered by her brushing off the dust. The lettering, though faded, read, "Sparrow Square Mint." Mint? In a small village? Harriet's mind churned with possibilities. Did they set up a mini-mint to create counterfeit coins? She grabbed the sign and tucked it into her satchel for closer inspection. Feeling her way along the wall, she ran her fingers across lumps that might mask a hidden recess. Though she found nothing obvious, the presence of the sign alone was enough to confirm her suspicion. A hush seemed to settle in the ruined building, as if the ghosts of that past operation still lingered. Harriet's evening ritual was taking shape into a full investigation. Her dining table, more cluttered than ever, now featured a small lamp, illuminating the old wooden sign from the blacksmith's cottage, "Sparrow Square Mint." Next to it lay a handful of old black and white photographs she'd unearthed in the library. She studied one photo showing the village market in 1932. Could Jeremiah Stone be among the crowd? The image was too fuzzy to tell. Between those photographs, her notes, and her transcriptions of the cottage graffiti, Harriet formed a hypothesis. The ring comprised local individuals, possibly including Jeremiah Stone, who used the blacksmith's tools and a discreet arrangement of coded messages scattered across the village to coordinate forging counterfeit coins. The operation might have been short-lived, but it left behind these cryptic scribblings. Out of habit formed by many nights of research, Harriet brewed a fresh pot of tea. Bear-shaped tea bags bobbed in her mug as she lost herself in the scribbled notes. She wondered if any tangible evidence of the coins still existed. Maybe a few had slipped through the net and ended up in some attic or hidden in a box of souvenirs? If the forging ring had disappeared without being conclusively caught, who knew what relics they'd left behind? At sunrise, Harriet decided to visit Mr. Gray, a local metal detector hobbyist. He often combed the fields around Sparrow's nest, occasionally unearthing old coins or bits of jewellery. She found him in his garden, packing his metal detector, a grin always ready on his wrinkled face. After Harriet explained her quest, Mr. Gray's eyes lit up. "I'd love to help," he said. "I've found some odd coins at the far edge of Miss Wickers's orchard. They looked fairly old, but I dismissed them as worthless. Let me fetch them." Harriet waited by her shed as he rustled through boxes of trinkets. He finally emerged with a small tin. Inside were 3 tarnished coins. They looked roughly like standard British currency from the early 20th century, but Harriet could see subtle inconsistencies in the shape of the lettering on their surface. Under close observation, she noticed the year was minted as 1933, in identical fashion on each coin, and the metal seemed lighter, as if not the usual alloy. Her pulse quickened. If these were indeed forgeries, they could be part of the ring's handiwork. Found them all next to each other. Thought it odd, but not quite interesting enough to investigate. Mr. Gray shrugged. "You can keep them if it helps your research." Harriet thanked him profusely, carefully slipping the coins into a labelled envelope. If she needed proof that the counterfeit ring was real, she now held it in her hand. Now Harriet had enough evidence to craft a coherent story of the forging ring. She'd planned to write an article for the local historical society, revealing her findings about the forgotten forgers of Sparrow's nest. But part of her kept wondering if she could piece together exactly who was involved, beyond Jeremiah Stone. She wanted closure, so she decided to check old police records in the county archive, an hour's drive away. Under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, Harriet scrolled through microfilm reels. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Lorraine, offered her advice on narrowing the date range. After several hours, Harriet found what she was seeking, a county report from November 1933. She read carefully, ignoring her stiff back and tired eyes. The report stated that local authorities had identified a covert operation forging counterfeit coins. Several suspects were named. Among them was Jeremiah Stone, but there were also 2 other names: Emma Hathaway and Lionel Pierce. The trio was allegedly led by an unknown master engraver. Evidence was too circumstantial for a robust prosecution. The group scattered, leaving behind partial fragments of their operation. Harriet's heart fluttered. She recognized Emma Hathaway as a surname from Miss Wicker's family line, and Lionel Pierce, his name was attached to the orchard near the old mill. That explained why Graffiti also showed up on those properties. If their forging ring was small but well coordinated, it made perfect sense. The master engraver was never identified. Possibly that person left Sparrow's nest with the forging plates, ensuring no direct proof could be uncovered. Harriet closed her laptop and left the county archive, feeling an almost nostalgic ache for a bygone era of cunning criminals. Still, she believed the truth deserved to be told, and in a village like Sparrow's Nest, a slice of dramatic history could add a new dimension of lore. Tying everything together, clues, records, the mysterious inscriptions, felt exhilarating, a testament to Harriet's passion for uncovering local stories. Upon returning home, she found a message on her answering machine from Miss Wickers. "Dear Harriet," it crackled. "I found something you might be interested in. An old trunk in my attic. It's covered in dust and has some kind of engraving on it. If you have time, do drop by." Harriet wasted no time. Within the hour, she was stepping into Miss Wicker's attic, beams of sunlight cutting through slanted windows. The trunk was indeed a dusty relic, bearing a carved design of what looked like, once again, sparrows in flight. Miss Wickers leaned on her cane. "I recall my grandmother saying something about a distant cousin who was involved in an antique coin business, Emma something or other. Do you think this might be tied to what you've been looking into?" Harriet knelt, gently wiping away the grime. The trunk's metal latch clicked open with difficulty. Inside were letters, a battered ledger, and a handful of small pouches. Harriet opened one of the pouches, gasping as she saw more of those suspiciously light coins. Another was filled with blank metal discs, presumably ready to be stamped. The ledger contained notes about distribution routes, names of towns, and figures that likely listed how many coins were passed. Many entries ended in cryptic abbreviations that Harriet assumed were code for particular couriers or safe houses. "This is it," Harriet breathed. "The final piece of the puzzle." She looked at Miss Wickers, her eyes bright. "These artifacts must have belonged to Emma Hathaway, your ancestor. She might have been directly involved with the forging ring." After promising Miss Wickers that she'd treat the discovery with respect, Harriet carefully packed the trunk's contents, intending to add them to the local historical society's archive. Mrs. Wickers seemed mostly intrigued and a little amused that her family's attic held such secrets. She insisted Harriet keep the trunk in the museum's display if the exhibit ever became a reality. That week, Harriet busied herself writing up the entire investigation into a coherent narrative. She assembled the photos of graffiti sections and included clear explanations of how each set of markings contributed to this hidden code. She inserted pictures of the forging equipment from the trunk, the handful of counterfeit coins donated by Mr. Gray, and sketches of the blacksmith's cottage. She wrote the story in an approachable style, capturing the charm of Sparrow's nest alongside the drama of the forger ring's clandestine activities. The local monthly newsletter eagerly agreed to publish Harriet's findings in a special historical feature. Word spread quickly. Residents dropped by Harriet's cottage, asking about details, praising her detective work. Suddenly, old secrets were all the rage, and neighbors swapped rumors about who might have once had hidden stashes of coins in their walls. Miss Wickers told Harriet that she'd discovered more dusty boxes in her attic, which she zealously rummaged through for possible relics. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the village hall hosted a small exhibition of Harriet's discoveries. She arranged a series of display boards with enlarged photographs of the graffiti side by side with her translations. The trunk from Miss Wicker's attic held pride of place, with one of the counterfeit coins placed on a velvet cushion. Harriet was delighted to see folks from all over Sparrow's nest gathering curiosity, their cheerful chatter filling the hall with warmth. Amid the crowd, Harriet recognized some local authorities, even representatives from the county's small museum system. One official, a tall man with a thin moustache, approached to admire the trunk. "This is remarkable," he said, tipping his hat politely. "I had no idea Sparrow's Nest harbored such intriguing hidden history. Would you consider having this displayed in the county museum?" Harriet smiled. "I need to discuss it with Ms. Wickers and the local historical society, but I believe that would be a wonderful way to share the story beyond our village." In the days that followed, Harriet found the quaint, peaceful existence of Sparrow's Nest taking on a renewed sense of pride. The story of the 1933 forger's homes, just a whisper of rumor in old documents, was now something tangible that tied together families, locations, and bits of graffiti once hidden under ivy. Villagers who had walked by the inscriptions for years without noticing them suddenly started pointing them out to visitors. New questions still tickled Harriet's mind, as any good historians would. Who exactly was the unknown master engraver? Did Jeremiah Stone live out his days in some distant town, haunted by memories of minted illusions in Sparrow's Nest? And did any of the coins slip into circulation, still floating around as hidden curiosities? Despite these uncertainties, Harriet felt satisfied that she had pulled back the veil on one of the village's long-lost chapters. Early one evening, Harriet treated herself to a quiet riverside stroll. She reflected on the path she'd travelled in recent weeks, from noticing faint graffiti under Ms. Wickers's ivy to chasing leads across old archives, from collecting clues at the blacksmith's ruin to uncovering a trunk of forgeries in an attic. The puzzle was as thrilling as any grand historical mystery, but with the delightful intimacy of a village that treasured her work. She paused on a small footbridge, watching the last rays of sun dance across the water. Nestled against the horizon, Sparrow's nest seemed a place of timeless secrets, each waiting to be found when the right pair of curious eyes came along. Harriet whispered to herself that there was always more to discover. The wind rustled the trees in a gentle hush, as if in agreement. She lingered a while longer, letting the moment fill her with contentment. Then, with a spring in her step, she headed back to the heart of the village. Back, perhaps, to find the next piece of local lore calling her name from the dusty corners of Sparrow's nest.